In my opinion, one of the worst camera crimes that people commit is buying a super expensive camera body. Maybe you've spent, $2,500 on a camera body. You might have even spent the same amount on a lens. Looking at a total kit price of around $5,000, and then very quickly you realize that for a lot of videography and photography, you need filters. So you hop on Amazon, you type in maybe a variable ND filter, and you end up with something like this. This is a Photograph 16-pound variable ND, so a super cheap little variable ND filter that for video will let you control the amount of light coming into your camera. The problem is that once you've spent a whole bunch of money on your camera system, if you then end up putting a cheap piece of glass in front of it, you're going to end up with cheap looking results. So when NiSi contacted me and asked if I wanted to share their brand new optical glass variable ND filter with you guys, what I actually wanted to do is compare this filter to a cheap alternative. This is obviously a fairly premium variable ND filter. They range in price. It starts at £89 here in the UK and goes up all the way up to £189 depending on the thread size. This is an 82mm, fairly common for wide angle lenses, and this one is going to set you back £169. So instead of just reviewing this piece of kit, I actually wanted to share with you guys what you get by purchasing something a little bit more expensive versus the cheap alternative. So if you don't know what a variable ND filter is, what it actually does is it lets you control the amount of light coming into your camera. So if we just dim this right down, you'll actually be able to see, if I whack this on the camera lens here, you can see that that has really crushed the amount of light going into the camera. Let's brighten this up a little bit. That should be looking very similar to how it did at the start, but there is obviously a little bit of ND there. That's in a nutshell what a variable ND actually does. Let's take it off here. The reason that in video production, variable ND filters or ND filters in general are very important is they allow you to maintain your camera settings whilst dictating the amount of light hitting the sensor. And what that means is we can actually control our aperture and keep a nice shallow depth of field and keep our motion looking nice and normal, whereas actually we are still able to control the amount of light coming into the camera. So the design and the packaging, and this is an obvious one where they're going to save money on the cheaper filter, the design of the NiSi is night and day compared to the Photograph variable ND. You can see on these sort of standard, slightly cheaper variation, it's just an endless scroll wheel here of ND filter, and just goes round and round. It literally is as simple as that. On the NiSi, you've got two pieces of glass. Obviously, you've got the controller, sort of filter black piece of glass here, and then a lower one on this sort of hard stop metal ring, and it like just feels so much more premium. It's even got this thing that you can screw in, so you can actually nice and easily slide this around, and there's a nice, really nice sort of tactile feedback. And this goes from 1 stop of variable ND to 5 stops of variable ND max. In terms of how they get to you and the storage, this is the Photograph case. Like, very simple, just a classic plastic case, and nothing fancy going on there. With the NiSi, you actually get this really nice Velcro casing, and you also get a plastic case as well to keep that nice and safe inside it. Like a super nice addition. You didn't necessarily need something like this, but what it does do is allows you to keep this nice and organized, nice and safe inside your bag. Okay guys, so we are outside now, and I've got the NiSi variable ND. It's pretty hard stopped up, so I reckon we're on about 4 stops of ND. And remember, this ND goes from 1 stop to 5 stops. But this is when an ND really comes in handy, if you're shooting outside using a variable ND filter. Because if I didn't have this filter on, I'd have to be stopped down to probably like aperture 20 or something to limit the amount of light coming in to the camera. It is a super bright sunny day, and it means it would be a nightmare to expose for without this ND. You can see that using the NiSi, it is super nice and clean. We're getting a really nice even color, and there's pretty much no color cast. For contrast, let's switch over and go to the Photograph. So this is the Photograph ND, and you might actually be able to see the colors look ever so slightly different, and there is a pretty noticeable bit of sort of dark hazing over this side. I can immediately even just see this looking at the camera display, so it's obviously going to be even more noticeable when I go across to my computer. A really big problem that the cheaper variable NDs have is if I scroll this down, you'll actually be able to see the brightness is kind of not consistent, and sometimes you're going to be left with a really horrible sort of X effect.
And this particularly comes into play if you happen to shoot long exposure photography. To shoot long exposure photography, you need ND on your camera. You might need quite a lot of ND, and shooting with something like the Fataga, you will end up with this sort of hatching cross effect, and that's something which the NiSi does not suffer from.
Color cast is one of the most significant issues that filters actually cause. Variable ND filters are typically quite affected by color cast because you actually have to have 2 layers of glass, and that's how it allows you to change the amount of light going into the camera. With the Fataga, you will run into situations where you do get quite bad color casting issues. I generally feel like this hue's a little bit warmer, a little bit more yellow anyway, and that is a real advantage of using something like the NiSi. For a filter of £169, you're actually buying something which isn't going to cause pretty much any distortion or degradation of the footage that you're shooting. NiSi actually have a true color technology. I don't know how this works, but it's something to do with the just optical quality of the glass in this filter. And it basically means that you shouldn't have any color cast using this filter. And from around a sort of month or so of usage, I think that's true. You're seeing a whole bunch of footage here that I shot from a trip to France. All of this was shot with the NiSi variable ND. In fact, it kind of looks just as you would expect pretty much out of the Canon R6 if I wasn't using any filter here. And that really is the kind of by far and away biggest advantage of the NiSi. Sometimes you will run into issues with the Fataga, and if you're on a professional set or you're doing any paid work, you just can't really have that using a cheaper filter. So let's play a little game here. I've got side-by-side shots of exactly the same shot, exactly the same camera settings. We'll shoot one with the Fataga, and then we will shoot one with the NiSi variable ND. Play it properly and see if you can guess which ones are which. Overall, I do actually think the Fataga does relatively well for a cheap ND filter. And I think by far and away, when it comes to the overall verdict of this, if you are a sort of hobbyist, amateur videographer, there's really nothing wrong with the Fataga £16 cheap variable ND. I think you'll be able to look past some of the issues that actually come up with a filter like this. By far and away, the NiSi variable ND filter is for professionals. It's for professional use or people taking their video a little bit more seriously than you would if you are most amateurs. For instance, the camera that is filming me right now, the Canon C70, the setup alone costs about $6,000. So I'm not going to go and put a £16 filter on that, but I would put this £169 NiSi filter because it's actually a relatively small investment compared to the significant investment of the camera itself. People often think paying a premium price for a filter, something that goes in front of their lens, is a bit of a waste of money, where in actual fact, I completely disagree with that because this is in front of your entire camera setup. You do not want to be ruining your footage with a pretty shoddy amateur filter that might end up producing a big cross over your footage or color casting your whole footage yellow. Like I said, personally, I think this is a brilliant product for the right person. Anyway, that's that from me. I hope you have found it interesting or helpful, and I'll catch you guys next time.